Good evening and welcome to Queerly Departed Online. Thank you so much for joining us. We are absolutely delighted that people from around the world have been able to join us for this evening's talk. My name is Charlie Carver and I'm the Business Development and Cemetery Services Manager for Brompton Cemetery. And Brompton Cemetery is part of the Royal Parks charity. The charity was created in 2017 to support and manage 5,000 acres of Royal Parkland across London. We look after 8 of London's largest open spaces: Hyde Park, Green Park, Richmond Park, Greenwich, St James's, Bushey, Regent's and Kensington Gardens. We also look after other important spaces in the capital, including Victoria Tower Gardens and Brompton Cemetery. The importance of providing publicly accessible green space has perhaps never been more evident than during the current pandemic. If you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation. And thank you so much for everyone that has made a donation for tonight's talk. We're really lucky to be joined by Claire, who works for AKT, our partner charity for this talk this evening. Claire's here to describe what her role is, what the charity AKT is, and why it's so important to support LGBT charities at this time.
Hi everyone. Hello. Thank you so much, Charlie. I am Claire, my pronouns are she, her, and I look after the data at AKT. So a little about the charity. We were previously Albert Kennedy Trust and we were founded in Manchester in 1989. We work nationally with young lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans young people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness after coming out or being outed by someone else. We were founded by Kath Hall, and she was this awesome ally who recognised that often LGBT young people just weren't getting enough support. When she set us up, the mainstream press wasn't too welcoming. She was dubbed the Witch of Withershaw. A local MP said she needed to have her head re-examined simply for setting up the trust. So we're forever grateful to her for persevering in the face of all that hostility. We work with LGBTQ+ young people across the UK and support them with housing, mentoring, advocacy, a lot more we're doing recently. And our referrals have really rocketed since the first lockdown. So we are seeing an increase of around 118% for young people coming to us. Some have experienced the first few lockdowns, literally locked down in really abusive households. We're fortunate that we have been able to develop our digital services, so that includes a live chat feature on our website now, so that we can still offer really meaningful support to young people, even when we can't see them, and give them the hug that we want to be giving them. Thank you so much to Queerly Departed and everyone involved in having us here today, and I am really excited for the evening, so thank you.
Charlie, can't hear you at the moment. I think you're muted.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much, Claire. While you were talking, I've just dropped the donate buttons for the Royal Parks and AKT into the link. So if anybody does want to make a donation, the links are there. So thank you so much. So this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sasha Coward, museum professional, who I am just going to put on the screen so you can see who he is. There we go.
Hello. Hello. We'll be introducing ourselves properly and we'll be invisible during the talk, but just know that I will be rhythmically moving my hands as per usual in the background. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Charlie.
And we are also joined by public historian Sheldon Goodman, who is also part of this talk this evening. So Sheldon, can you give us a wave?
I can. Hello everyone, Sheldon from Cemetery Club here. Absolutely delighted to be here in part of this LGBTQ History Month, looking at the queer dead of Brompton Cemetery. We've got some corkers in store for you.
Thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. The session is going to last approximately an hour with a 15-minute question and answer at the end. You'll see that your cameras are off and you've all been muted. That just helps us. But we do have a chat function, so it should be a little memo box at the top of your screen on the left-hand side, maybe the right-hand side. If you've got any questions for Claire from AKT or for Sasha or Sheldon, drop them in the Q&A and I will be asking them those questions at the end of the session. So this evening, the Cemetery Club are going to be shining light on people that often get overlooked in the cemetery. So our very dear queerly departed. So expect to meet cheaters with diamond leashes, pretty policemen, and perhaps we're going to bump into the Bride of Frankenstein. I think that's enough from me. Bear in mind, this is also being recorded. So if you need to nip off or you missed the start, don't worry. In a few weeks' time, we're going to put it on our YouTube page. So that's enough from me. Let me hand you over to Sasha and Sheldon.
So just while Sheldon gets the talk up and running, I think I'm just going to start by saying that this started out as a real life tour. So this was something that we did in person. And obviously in the transition to doing stuff online, it's not quite the same. We can't bring the stories to life in quite the same way, but we're going to do our best. So we're going to give you the best facsimile of the real life tour that we can possibly do. And one thing I want to say is a couple of messages before we introduce ourselves. So queerly departed, it has the word queer in it. We will be using that word a lot. Now, I fully understand why a lot of people who belong to the LGBTQ plus community might not like that word because it was been used as a pejorative. When I was at school, it was both an insult and an identity. So I know that for some people who are not comfortable with this, I understand if you don't want to use it yourself. Now, when you hear me and Sheldon use the word queer, the way that we're using it is a reclaimed term. So we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual people, the huge spectrum of people. And there's a lot of other things that are going to come up in terms of people that passed away a long time ago. They may well have not used the word lesbian or gay or bisexual. Those words didn't exist back then. So we're not here to talk about dead people and stick labels on them, labels they would not have used. But we are going to try and talk about their lives and how their lived experience, you know, the people they loved, the lives they led, will resonate with LGBTQ people today. All right, Sheldon, shall we get on and give an introduction to who the hell we are?
Indeed.
So first of all, I guess I will introduce myself. I'm the one on the left with the silly gilet and the badge. My name is Sasha Coward, and you probably can't see me. I'll be like the voice of God, as will Sheldon as we go through the tour. But I've been working in museums for about 10 years now. So museums were my bread and butter. And when I met Sheldon, who is a collaborator, but also a dear, dear friend of mine, I cannot wait till I can give him a real life hug again. He got me into cemeteries, and he told me the concept that cemeteries are basically museums of the dead. They're museums of people. And so we developed this tour with Brompton Cemetery using some of the research that they've done already to put together a tour about LGBTQ plus related stories in the cemetery. This is one of the projects I've been most proud of in the last couple of years, so I think you're going to have a really good time. So Sheldon, who are you?
Well, I am Sheldon, and I run something called the Cemetery Club, which I've been doing for about 7 years now. And as Sasha said, I see cemeteries as museums of people. They're fascinating social resources which are jam-packed full of human history. And as a member of the LGBTQ community myself, I was approached by a former employee of Brompton Cemetery by the name of Daniel Gilbert to work with a volunteer by the name of Floria London to bring these stories to life, because although cemetery stories with the people who rest in cemeteries are slowly having their tales told again, as interest in cemeteries, as again these kind of incredible social history spaces takes hold. In terms of LGBTQ history within the cemeteries themselves, I think that was an area that kind of needed, well, there's much more work to do, particularly in this country. And I'm very proud of the fact that Sasha, and the cemetery and the volunteers helped put together what was the first queer cemetery tour in the country. So I'm fiercely proud of that. And yeah, basically I love cemeteries, and that's kind of where I come from in terms of that.
So moving on, one of the things that sadly you're going to be left out of, so what we're not able to bring you is some of the other stuff that we did at the event. So when we do this in person, we don't just do tours, we also have drag performers and poetry and other things going on the side. So if we can move on to the next slide, Sheldon. So for example, we had amazing drag queen Virgin Extravaganza. We had the drag queen Son of a Tutu opening our events. We wanted this to be like a queered tour, so that's using that as a verb. We wanted to create a tour that felt different. It had different content, but it also felt a bit different. Also, our wonderful poets Tony D and Keith, who brought like the voices of people of colour alive in this space, they are also not able to be part of this tour tonight. So that's something that's lacking. You've got just me and Sheldon, and hopefully we will try and do the tour justice, as I said before. But when you can, and when we can do this again in real life, do come along, because we would love to see you. And it is a special experience when you can actually be there in person.
Right, so in terms of queer history, what is queer history? It's a complicated beast, is queer history, because although history, generally speaking, it's not the easiest of things to research, queer history is almost like looking for a needle in a haystack. Now, this is, as I alluded to in the introduction, this is the first cemetery-based kind of investigation to those who would have identified as LGBTQ. We're using modern terminology here, and I say the term modern lens here is one of the bullet points. We're using terms like homosexual, lesbian, and so on. These are kind of terminologies that didn't exist in the lifetimes of these people. So just bear that in mind, as you know, we're kind of doing a modern kind of expression of how these people probably were. So in terms of that as well, that's a difficulty we have to overcome. And also, it's a minority history. History does tend to be dominated, in my experience, by white Victorian men. So giving queer voices from the past a voice, literally a voice, is hugely important. And, you know, again, we talk about queer women and, you know, people of colour and so on. Those are some of the stories that we hope are also buried in Brompton Cemetery. And it also highlights the fact that this is an ongoing project. The people that you hear again, and the queer history that you hear of today, is still being worked on. You know, there are over 250,000 people buried in the cemetery. We've identified a probable 7 or 8. There are far more stories to be told here. And again, just to kind of give a quick another nod to Floria London and Dan Gilbert, who were kind of the originators of this project to begin with. So, first on, okay, just again, just to kind of give you the live experience that you're missing. These are the 2 drag queens that Sasha spoke of earlier, Virgin Extravaganza on the left and Son of a Tutu on the right. Imagine, when we do this live again, do come, you will find it amazing. So first off, we have the Keeleys. Now, the Keeley family, I'll start with Robert Keeley and Mary Ann Keeley. They are buried just off the portion of the cemetery that I showed you on the screen. They were an acting husband and wife that were very prominent in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, they weren't queer themselves, so why are they being mentioned in this talk? Let me get to that. I'll explain. I'll talk about Robert Keeley. Again, he looks like the traditional Victorian gent on the left-hand side there. He was born in 1793, and he was one of 16 children. And when he was old enough at the age of 16 himself, he was apprenticed to Hansard, and which was the official printer to the Palace of Westminster. His father was a watchmaker, and with a large brew to support, basically getting into any kind of work was, you know, pretty much the priority, because money was obviously very tight. And he didn't like it. He hated the job. He kind of, you know, he was a very theatrical person by nature. And so he ditched that very quickly and then went off to join a travelling acting company. He first started performing, his proper first gig was at the Richmond Theatre in 1813, where he then moved to Norwich, where he had a residency for 4 years, and then kind of came back to London and performed in you know, various kind of productions and plays on the London stage. Now, he had many notable roles over the years, and it's funny how in this tour Frankenstein becomes a bit of a running theme. Charlie alluded to how we'll meet the Bride of Frankenstein later. Well, in the staged versions of Frankenstein as a play, when it was being transcribed from the book, He originated the role of Fritz, also known as Igor, who was basically Dr. Frankenstein's assistant. So he actually had that role in 1823 when it was put into words by a guy by the name of Richard Brinsley Peake. Now, Peake is also the one who came up with the phrase, "It lives." And again, we'll get to that phrase later as we talk about one of the noted actors who appeared in the sequel in the 1930s. Now, his LGBT link, and indeed I'll get onto Mary Ann's shortly, is that they both indulged in gender swap roles. I'll probably talk about Mary firstly in terms of that thing, but they both play. So Mary played principal boys and Robert played women predominantly. So Mary, again, here she is in the principal boy role. She was originally from Ipswich and she was born in 1806, and she had a fine singing voice. And at the age of 20, she starred she starred in Rosina, which was an English comic opera. Now, she married Robert in 1829, and they basically performed as a pair. And again, they were a very well-established and very popular acting couple on the London scene. She also played, as one of her kind of male roles, the 18th century criminal Jack Sheppard, which was a role that was played also by Nellie Farren, who again was a principal boy actor. She's actually buried not too far from the Keeleys, and you actually got a picture of me here actually stood by Nellie's grave to give you a kind of sense of, well, number one, what Brompton Cemetery is like, but also the kind of grandeur, the Victorian wonder that you have on these particular headstones and stuff. And you know, she was a very noted actress in her own right. But going back to Mary herself, she also played another role, the 18-year-old Smike, young companion, friend and cousin to the titular Nicholas in Nicholas Nickleby. She was a simple boy with no confidence and was very friendly with Charles Dickens. Now, they were, as I said, they were known for their kind of gender swap roles, and I should probably introduce you to Robert's best known role. He was known as a lady. I say the character he often played was a character by the name of Mrs. Caudle, who was your typical Victorian busybody character. She was quite theatrical, and the staging of the plays that he was in was, you can see she's holding a candle, is in character, she would basically climb into bed, and her poor husband, who was trying to get some sleep, would be unable to, because she would be wittering away, talking about, you know, this, that, and the other, loving sensation, loving gossip, and to Victorian audiences, this was hilarious. Now, this is also at a time when cross-dressing was a bit of a hot potato in terms of a topic in London society, because around about this time in the 1870s, Boulton and Park, better known as Fanny and Stella, after this you can Google them, who were a very well-known and infamous pair of homosexual men who would openly cross-dress as women. And they were arrested in 1870 on trumped-up charges, essentially, where they were accused of buggery. And they were put through a horrific court ordeal where they were given a medical examination, which was frankly disgraceful. And it was noted at the time that even though the charges should be investigated, the manner of which they were, and these poor homosexual men who, again, it wasn't a crime at the time, that would be dealt with later in terms of how they appeared openly to London society. But it's interesting to see that Robert Keeley here was actually also kind of leading the charge in the way that gender was being shown on stage. This is another kind of image of what kind of how it would have been staged on the stage, with Robert talking against the poor husband who was desperately trying to get some sleep. Now, how best can I actually kind of have a modern equivalent, say modern, a recent equivalent of what this character was like? Mrs. Caudle was essentially Hyacinth Bouquet in terms of mannerisms, in terms of eccentricity, in terms of general scale. So even though Hyacinth Bouquet, played here by Patricia Routledge on Keeping Up Appearances, is one of those iconic, well, essentially, yeah, a queer icon themselves, the way that kind of bombastic character existed, particularly on the London stage, was going on way back in the 1860s and 1870s. So that's the Keeleys.
Moving on to one, and I'm not meant to have favourites. I feel like I might get in trouble with the deceased if I have favourites, but LUISA is an incredible character, and it's worth just touching back on the Keeleys and saying we wouldn't have RuPaul's Drag Race, we wouldn't have drag if it wasn't for performers playing around with gender. You know, Nelly was in many ways a drag king. But moving on to Louisa, now these photos, I mean, they already start telling you a story. But I think one of the funniest things about Louisa that gives you a sense of who she was is her name. So her name here is Luisa Casati, but the way that she liked to be referred to was by her full name, which was Luisa Adela Rosa Maria Amanni Marchesa Casata Stampa di Soncino. So just so you know, this is not someone who likes to make a quiet, polite entrance. This is someone who wants to be known. Now, Luisa Casati, she was so ahead of her time. She was born all the way back in 1881 in Milan, then moved to London, spent a large part of her time in the UK and Europe. But she was known for throwing these incredible parties. So I want us to picture this. It's quite difficult in lockdown, I know, to picture going to a party, but let's all just go there together. So you go there and there's a beautiful spiral staircase. And descending the spiral staircase is, I'm going to say, a creature. Because Louisa often didn't even look human. She didn't want to look pretty. Quote, she wanted to look like a living work of art. And she would come down the spiral staircase wearing a live anaconda around her neck, walking 2 live cheetahs on diamond-studded leashes. It was all about performance. And let's remember, this is long before the RSPCA. I feel like they would have a thing or two to say about Louisa. Louisa loved to surprise and often frighten her guests. A classic party was where she got a famous waxwork artist to produce loads of waxworks that looked just like Louisa, and they left them all over the party, all completely frozen. So everyone was walking up to these waxwork figures being like, Louisa? And then realizing they're talking to a wax dummy. But Louisa poised herself, covered in olive oil so that she looked shiny, pretending to be a waxwork. And people would come up to her and think she was a waxwork, and she could listen to them gossiping about her, saying how ridiculous she was. She loved to play tricks. And if you look on the left, there's this outfit that she wore to a ball where she dressed literally as a fountain. If you've seen the most recent US Drag Race episode, you'll see that the last one had Denali dressing up as a giant fountain and saying, this is the most incredible drag you'll ever see. Stolen from Luisa Casati. Luisa was an inspiration for fashion designers. Seriously, if you look at these photos, just remember that these were taken in the 1800s. These Vogue-worthy images were taken in the 1800s. So what's the queer connection? She wasn't just fabulous. Moving on to the next slide, please, Sheldon. It's about the life that she led. Now, one part of her life was when she moved to the Isle of Capri. Now, back in the late 1800s, Capri, if you were to say, oh, well, you know, he goes to Capri, it was basically an allusion for saying someone was gay or queer. And there's an amazing book that is written and includes Louisa. It's written by a man called Compton Mackenzie about the, quote, extraordinary women that he met on the Isle of Capri. Now, the extraordinary women, they were all lesbian and bisexual women. That's basically what the story is about. It's about a group of women who lived and loved together. And Louisa, she was part of that. She was part of this commune. And during that time, she met the woman in the centre, Romaine Brooke. So Romaine was an artist herself and loved to play around with gender. So Romaine's favourite thing was to see if she could go to a party and be confused for a gentleman. Now, she used her, she, her pronouns, so she would have defined as a woman and probably as a lesbian woman today. But she came to Capri with her girlfriend. So when she arrived, her and her girlfriend came and were on the beach where they came across Louisa, who apparently was almost completely nude, walking around the beach, and Romaine could not take her eyes off this creature, this fascinating creature. It's known that the painting on the right was painted by Romaine. Romaine painted Louisa in the nude, and that Romaine's girlfriend at the time was incredibly jealous. She was incandescent with rage in that Romaine had this new favourite. So Louisa was bisexual and bodacious. It wasn't about the gender of the person, it was about how fabulous they were. And also, and I hope Louisa won't mind me saying this, it was about how fabulous they might make her look as well. She would do anything for the scandal. This is a person who came into a party wearing chicken blood, covering herself in chicken blood, like that scene in Carrie. And you can imagine this is the Victorian Edwardian era, the stellar impact she would make. The newspapers were agog. Forget Katie Price, forget Lady Gaga. LUISA CASATI was the most incredible queer character of that period of time, I would argue. Now, sadly, her story doesn't end quite as fabulously as it begins. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see me and Sheldon are beside the grave of LUISA, and it is not a grand tomb. It's tiny, right? It's this small little urn. LUISA died in poverty. She died in Knightsbridge in 1957. And before passing away, she was known for being this incredibly camera-shy older lady, because once LUISA got old, she was terrified of having her photo taken. She didn't want to see herself, as an older person. And she would go around and was seen going through bins, finding beads and feathers and bits of fabric that she could turn into dresses. She was basically turning dresses, creating dresses from trash, from rubbish, from stuff she would find littered on the street. We're talking about the original, like, Alaska Thunderfuck drag queen. We're talking the original concept of taking garbage and making it glamorous. But to this day, people still come to LUISA's tomb. They come to her grave and they leave photographs, they leave makeup, they leave jewelry. And you can see there, I was having a look at the photos that people leave her. So she is remembered despite having this tiny, unassuming grave. People come to find LUISA, which I think is just beautiful. So that moves us on to someone else, Sheldon. Who have we got next?
Next, we have Charles Alston Collins. Now, again, I spoke in the introduction about how this is an ongoing project. This is not, we haven't just found everyone and just leaving it at that. After we did the first Queerly Departed tour 2 years ago now, I was informed by historian Lucinda Hawksley, who happens to be the descendant of Charles Dickens, about another resident of Brompton who was probably homosexual. And this was a gentleman by the name of Charles Alston Collins. Now, Charles Alston Collins, again, is one of those names in history that you're probably not too familiar with. You're probably more familiar with, say, his older brother, Wilkie Collins, who was the author of A Woman in White. Now, Charles was the younger brother, and he was married to Charles Dickens's favourite daughter, Kate. And it was, again, he's a fascinating chap in terms of just general kind of in terms of like just general social history, because he was a bit of a polymath, like many people were back in those days. He was a painter, a writer. He was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, for example, and he entered into the Royal Academy schools and was a friend of another titan of British art, John Everett Millais, and they had a very close relationship. I postulate that perhaps there was something more to their friendship, because it was a very close, intimate relationship, which was kind of sullied a little bit as Charles got older and he kind of threw himself more into religious works and found and kind of threw himself into the kind of like high church practices. But there was a closeness between those two men, I think, which is subject to further ongoing academic study. But he was a remarkable chap. Now, he's actually shown on the right hand side here, a little bit older. It's a bit of a pixelated image, but this is in the doorway of Charles Dickens's Kent residence, Gads Hill Place. And Charles is just seated on the doorstep there, kind of looking at a newspaper. Again, it's a little bit pixelated, but he's sat to his right hand side with Kate as his bride. Now, as I said, he was a bit of a polymath. He was capable of doing some remarkable things. He did May in the Regent's Park, which you can see here on the screen, which was painted in 1852. Other paintings include Bellegrina's Alarm, Convent Thoughts, and The Good Harvest of 1854. Now, when he was younger, he nearly drowned, and it kind of gave him lifelong anxiety, to the point where even painting a picture would bring on nervous fits. He would have terrible stomach pains, and whether this would manifest into the eventual, what is suspected to be cancer that eventually took his life in 1873, again, we can only speculate. But you've got people like William Holman Hunt, who described him as slight with slender limbs, but erect in the head and shoulders, beautifully cut features, a large chin, a crop of orangey coloured hair, latterly a beard, blue eyes that looked at a challenger without a sign of quarrelling. So he was quite a striking looking man. Now, in terms of his intimacies, now again, there is the supposed relationship with John Everett Millais, but we don't know. We do know that he supposedly fell in love with Maria Rossetti, but was rebuffed. And this kind of, to an already nervous person, this kind of pushed him even further into the depths of despair. And he became incredibly introverted. Now, in 1860, he became engaged to Charles Dickens' daughter, Kate. Now, Charles didn't really approve of this match. Whether he had his suspicions, we don't know. But what we do know is that, I mean, again, it's also ironic that Charles would have could have such thoughts considering his own personal life. And again, that's a talk for a completely another time. But Charles Dickens' own personal life is incredibly muddied and complicated. But it was a marriage between both Charles and Kate which served a purpose. Kate wanted to get away from her father, who was basically creating a nightmarish situation in the family home. And Charles, I think, you know, again, if he was a homosexual male, probably wanted to present to his peers that he was, you know, a godly, just, right man. So they got married. Wasn't the happiest of wedding nights, because Charles Dickens was basically sobbing into Kate's wedding dress on his knees, going, "Why are you marrying him? Why are you marrying him?" So, you know, again, that kind of didn't really start their married life off to the best of starts. And they you know, they kind of muddled on. They after their wedding, they went to Paris, and they lived a very frugal life. And again, at the time when a respectable, you know, a author's daughter, and indeed a very successful painter and writer, chose to have no servants. They were basically living very, very kind of lower middle class lives. But there was also a problem in that the relationship was not sexual. And again, this is where the historical archive, and particularly when you're looking at queer history, you have these questions that don't seem to have any overt, obvious answers. We do know that Kate would frequently write to Charles and go, you know, basically, he seems to be rather impotent. We don't seem to be doing that much. And there's also rumours that she herself would actually go on to have an affair with another painter by the name of Val Prinsep. Now, again, these are rumours that are circulating in the Dickens family to this day. Was he or wasn't he? We just don't know. But in terms of his actual kind of leanings, we know that he, again, as I mentioned before, he died in 1873 of what is suspected to be stomach cancer. And in a peculiarity that, again, you will find littered in most Victorian cemeteries, and the fact that Victorians loved death in any way. When just shortly after he died, he was sketched on his deathbed by William Holman Hunt. And this sketch is actually from the archives of the University of Birmingham, and it shows him literally just moments after death with a short couple of verses from a piece of prose that he wrote in the 1850s. But again, it's one of those characters that we are unable to fully know what was going on. He certainly would have kind of led a double life in some respects of what we know. But again, just one of those fascinating characters that we have buried in Brompton Cemetery we'd dearly love to know more about. So, Sasha, on to you.
Moving on to Pretty Policeman, which is sadly not quite as lovely and sexy story as it might sound. So this is an interesting reflection on Brompton Cemetery and how it's been used, not just for burying dead people, but for people who are very much alive. So the cemetery, and pretty much any green space in a large city, has been used as a cruising ground. For those who are not aware what that means, it tends to refer to gay or bisexual men who use outdoor spaces as places to meet and have sex with other men. And this has been going on since pretty much the dawn of time, particularly when homosexuality or same-sex relationships have been, looked down upon or have been made to be illegal. So whilst we can be quite critical of this, and if you look at the newspapers, the idea of cruising is seen as dangerous and dirty and filthy. It's one of the stereotypes that is often labelled at gay men, is the idea of, they'll do it anywhere and God, they're so desperate. You have to realise that this kind of has arisen as an adaptation to the fact that for so many, well, the vast majority of history, to be a man and to want to have a relationship with another man was not just frowned upon, it was the end of your life. It was the end of your career. As we'll come across later, there were scandals. People took their own lives. This was not something you could do. So finding a space that was safe, where you could have these relationships, was sometimes the only option to even have these kinds of relationships. Now, it's from the 70s and 80s that we start to see the arrival of the Pretty Policeman. So a pretty policeman is a nickname given to a police officer who is basically sent to a cruising area intentionally out of costume, you know, not wearing their outfit, not wearing the hat or anything, in civilian wear, to intentionally cruise other men, to go and make eye contact, look for other gay men, and when that man would then initiate any kind of response, romantic or sexual, they would be arrested. So it was basically a honey trap, and this went on for years and years. It's basically a sting operation, a way to try to, you know, hijack and try to find LGBT people, and particularly gay men, in these spaces, and to arrest them for just trying to have what everyone wants to have. Everyone wants to feel intimate, and everyone wants to have a relationship of some kind. Now, the poster on the left is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing. So we invented the word the policeman's ball, right? So as a fundraiser, the London Gay Switchboard created an event called the Pretty Policeman's Ball. And it's worth regarding that Brompton Cemetery was one of the most highly policed spaces in terms of arresting gay and bisexual men in the whole of London. So Sheldon, if we move on to the next slide, I think you had a still from a video that you were going to talk about.
Indeed, yes. So it would be lovely to play this, but I don't think the systems can take it. This is a video that is freely available to watch on YouTube. So once we're done here, I encourage you to go and see it. It is, I mean, if you just input Brompton Cemetery cruising, it should basically come up as the top result. And it was made in the 1980s. And it was basically a guy going around Brompton Cemetery with a camcorder and a microphone, interviewing people. Now, the people who were frequenting Brompton Cemetery in the 1980s, as Sasha has just said, were they were either gay or bisexual men. And although there is nothing kind of overtly suggested in the video, there is a lot of innuendo and there is a lot of supposition, and it doesn't take a genius to work out why they were there in the first place. It's a fascinating snapshot into a part of the cemetery's history that is just as valid as the rest of it in terms of, you know, being a place of rest, as a place of memory, and a place to remember our dearly departed. And so, again, the video itself runs for about 10 to 15 minutes, and they're talking about, you know, everything and nothing. The Coleherne Tavern, which Sasha will mention shortly, is mentioned. They talk about sexuality. There's a lot of innuendo, and it's a fascinating snapshot. Now, going from the YouTube comment, one of the people who comments on this video is actually, he's either the friend of the person, or he may even been the person who actually shot the footage. Now, one of these, I think the chap on the left is called Brian, I think. It is heavily suggested, although I do need to double check this, that neither the chap on the left or the chap on the right, I think, is still with us. The exact reasons, I don't know why or how. Hopefully they still are, but thinking of the time with which these gentlemen were living in, and obviously with the recent airing of It's a Sin on Channel 4, we don't know. But I hope they're alive and well, and they can contribute to the wider history of the story. But the way it was written in the comments, it suggested that they're no longer with us, and, you know, an interesting part and a highly contentious and upsetting part of our history as well.
Yeah, the HIV crisis, in fact, it leads on to what I was going to say, because Brompton Cemetery even inspired a song, and the song was written by the Pet Shop Boys. The song is called A Man Could Get Arrested, right? And there is a particular lyric in that, which is, you want to see a doctor before our love is tested. How much longer a man could get arrested? And this lyric is about cruising in Brompton Cemetery. And if you think of the 80s, when this video was taken, the fear of being a gay man, this is the one place where maybe you can be yourself and you can meet someone, but also there is a danger because there is a disease and it is killing your friends. If we move on to the next slide, there's a couple of quotes which are taken directly from Brompton Cemetery. So both of these come from people who were interviewed in the 70s and 80s, and both of these were arrested by pretty policemen in Brompton Cemetery. So I was once in Brompton Cemetery and a pretty policeman nabbed me and I was arrested. I wasn't sent to prison, but I was taken to court, convicted and fined, and I thought, this is ridiculous. He came on to me. I didn't come on to him, but that was just the way it was, a constant threat. And the other one is later, 1981, so again, thinking about the era of the likes of It's a Sin, I reveal that in West Brompton Cemetery circa 1981, I was charged under the 1860 Ecclesiastical Court Jurisdiction Act, having revealed my penis to the cop who had been cruising me for over an hour, and I assume wanted to see it. Will I be pardoned? Now, there's one thing to take from this, is both of these people were humiliated, right? What an embarrassing experience. No one wants to be arrested or discover that the person that they thought was attracted to them actually is a policeman in disguise. And yet both of them have this sense of humour about it. There's this wonderful thing about the queer community that we're able to take like a scream of pain and set it to a beat that you can dance to. We're able to take something that's hurtful and make it funny. That's where drag queens get their power, right? And it's a sense of, I thought he was into it, or I thought he wanted to see it. That even in those moments, we have this sense of humour. So moving on to the next slide, we have the Coleherne pub, which is what Sheldon mentioned. And the Coleherne pub, I cannot say this clearly enough, it was literally around the corner. It was on the other side of the road of Brompton Cemetery. There is a reason why the police were so active in Brompton Cemetery, and it's because gay men were walking to and from the biggest gay pub in the whole of the 1980s in London, which was right opposite the cemetery. They were walking through the cemetery to get to the station. So if a couple who had had a couple of drinks and they met in the Coleherne pub and they go for a wander, maybe a little walk in summer, maybe they were heading home together and maybe have a kiss on the way home through Brompton Cemetery, while there'd be a policeman there to catch them. It was perfectly timed. It was a perfect space, because forget Soho, this Earl's Court back in the 70s and 80s, that was the true gay hub of London. And there's a lovely little quote here. I love the image too. So you have drag performers, people playing around with gender and sexuality, people of all races and ethnicities, all coming together in this gay bar, this queer bar, lesbians too, everyone welcome. And this quote, and just to show that mask for mask isn't a new thing, I was standing at the bar going crazy, leching this big gorgeous hunk like something from Village People. He was tall, handsome with a moustache, and of course he was wearing a hard hat helmet. The barman came over, and the campest, the most effeminate voice possible, this hunk of a man said, "A double gin and tonic, please, darling." I love this. And there are problematic things about the treatment of femme gay men. But at the time, again, there's a sense of humour. We were so oppressed, all of us, and yet we still like to narrate our stories with a bit of a twist. Now, I'm about to tell a story that's a little bit upsetting, so a slight trigger warning. I am going to be talking about murder at this point. If you would like to mute the audio for the next 3 or 4 minutes, it will be done by then. There's no graphic imagery or anything. But moving on to another reason the Coleherne pub was so famous was relating to the murders convicted, done by a man known as Colin Ireland. So if I can have the next slide, please, Sheldon. So Colin Ireland would prey specifically on punters at the Coleherne pub. Now, when he was arrested, he was defined as a sociopath. He murdered his victims horribly, but he never defined as gay. But he did actively seek out a gay bar because he knew that the young men then, and the older men too, would be vulnerable, right? That they were easy prey. And this is just to go and show that there is a dark side to queer history. We were suffering from HIV, this disease that was killing our friends. We had nowhere where we could find love, so we were going to try to find it the few spaces we could. And there were people actively preying on us, and all the while, we were the people that were being arrested. We were the people that were being written about in the press. And I just want to name the 5 men who were murdered by the so-called gay slayer, which were Peter Walker, Chris Dunn, Perry Bradley, Andrew Collier, and Emmanuel Spireri, and many of whom were met by Colin in the Coleherne pub and would have walked home through Brompton Cemetery, possibly one of the last walks that they ever took. So again, apologies for a deeply tragic story, but we can't do queer history without touching on that every now and then. All right, can you lift our spirits a little bit, please, Sheldon?
Yes, I can. Again, we shouldn't have favourites. We shouldn't have favourites on this talk, but this is mine. Oh, Ernest Thesiger, darling Ernest Thesiger. Amazing, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful actor. And out of all the people that we have buried in Brompton Cemetery, he's probably the one that we know for sure. We know his orientation, we know his kind of impulses, we know his passions, we know his desires, because he frankly didn't give a flying whoopsie about what people thought about him. A fascinating, fascinating chap. He came from a long line of diplomats and politicians and explorers. He very much broke the mould and became one of the greatest, if not most underrated actors of the 20th century, and he appeared in over 60 films. His best known role, however, was probably when he was, again, it's been alluded to beforehand, when he appeared as Dr. Septimus Pretorius, the mentor of Dr. Frankenstein, in the 1935 film The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, Thesiger was born in the 15th of January 1879 in Chelsea, and despite his family background in law, war and empire, he expressed an interest in painting. So he thought, well, to hell with you lot, I'm going to go off to the Slade School of Art and I'm going to train to be an artiste, which is what he did. It was here that he met what we would assume to be his lover. Again, the historical things aren't sure, but it is incredibly likely. He met a chap by the name of William Rankin, who had a very close, intimate relationship with. Now, for reasons unknown, again, a bit like Charles Alston Collins, perhaps he was trying to keep up appearances, he ended up marrying William's sister Jeanette. And the shock of this put William into such a downward spiral that he shaved his head in protest. And if you go onto sites like the British Newspaper Archive, you can see them, their wedding photos were published in newspapers of the time. Again, maybe he would have identified as bisexual rather than homosexual. We don't. Again, the modern lens is looking down and seeing his kind of intimacy in his relationships. But one thing for sure, particularly with Ernest, is, as I said, his background was privileged, and it allowed him to be himself than, say, someone buried in Brompton Cemetery who may have identified as queer and is buried in a common grave, who was of the working class, who was not able to be, to basically mince down the street. For example, when the First World War broke out, Ernest Thesiger signed up, not because he wanted to further British interests or to defend the country, it's because he thought he'd look good in a kilt. I mean, that kind of, it's the fact that, never mind what actual warfare was actually like at the time. He's even quoted as going, "Oh, I thought a kilt would suit me. I applied to the London Scottish headquarters, but my Scottish accent, assumed for the occasion, was apparently not convincing, and I was referred to another London regiment. Got into a taxi, I consulted the list of recruiting stations and found myself in a queue outside the headquarters of the Queen Victoria Rifles in Davies Street. I came away a few hours later as a member of His Majesty's Army." And when asked about his experience in the war, he was very candid. He said, "Oh my dear, the noise, the people, didn't get on with it." But when the war was over, that's kind of when he started to really kind of diversify into acting. His first kind of film debut was the 1916 spoof, The Real Thing at Last, where he played one of the witches in Macbeth in drag. And again, if you look on Google, there are images of him dragged up, presenting himself as a woman. Fascinating imagery considering the time. Now, he met gay director James Whale after filming The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1919, and they struck up a friendship, and he was eventually cast in his first big screen role in J.B. Priestley's The Old Dark House in 1932, alongside horror supremo Boris Karloff. Following year, he appeared as the Scottish butler, again alongside Karloff in The Ghoul. Now, 1935, again, his kind of best-known role, Septimus Pretorius in The Bride of Frankenstein. And again, I kind of alluded it back to Robert Keeley, how Frankenstein is one of the stories that really does resonate with the queer community. And this is echoed by the likes of film historian David Scal, who comments that the old horror films do have a certain resonance for gay people. Monster movies are more about sexual repression, amongst other things, and homosexuality is one form of sexuality that has traditionally been repressed. Now, it's very clear how Ernest played Septimus Pretorius. He basically played him as himself, that is, as a bit of an old queen. Now, if you've ever watched any of The Bride of Frankenstein, again, you can watch on YouTube, fascinating, how Ernest presents himself. He comes into a room, he flares his nostrils, he goes, he just like kind of really comes across as a very theatrical old gent, and it's absolutely fascinating to see. And it's also interesting that the way he plays the role, he plays it as if he's very much in love with the character of Frankenstein, his kind of his protege. There's a bit where Frankenstein's newlywed wife comes in, and he basically gives her a scowling look and flares his nostrils and goes, how dare you interrupt my time with Frankenstein? So it's a very interesting that, again, this was happening in the 1930s, and he would have been aware how this was being presented to a film-going public. Now, he played a number of theatrical roles until his death in 1961. His main passion was needlework. This is one of the most sublime, and I honestly mean this, the most sublime videos on YouTube, where I think this was filmed in between takes of a film or something, and he's literally, you know, in full regalia, and he's just doing needlepoint. As you can see in this image here, I took this from the London Dead blog, which is run by David Bingham, and it shows a chair that Thesiger himself embroidered. And it also goes on to show papier-mâché kind of models and figures, and he did one of Elizabeth I as well. He was, again, going back to his time where he studied at art school, he was clearly very crafty. He was a crafty old queen. Now, just moving on, so yeah, we've got the poster here, The Bride and Frankenstein. This was the American release. Thesiger's kind of relegated to kind of like a very small name, but again, hugely important in terms of how this film was presented, and is probably one of its best known actors in terms of our kind of appreciation of it, in terms of film and movie history. Where is he in Brompton? Well, if any of you are lucky enough or fortunate enough to live locally and you want to kind of scope him out, you might just see the end of the open air cathedral bit there of the central portion of the cemetery. He's buried in the Thesiger plot. It's a series of 3 plots where notable luminaries of the Thesiger family are buried. He's buried with his mum, who was Georgina, and he was buried there in 1961. Fascinating chap. Do check him out. So from Thesiger, we kind of rewind into history slightly, and we go into a bit of Soho history. Again, Soho, one of those districts that we can't go to at the moment because of lockdown, but it is the cradle of gay life in London, although it's only really been the cradle of gay life for the past 30 years or so. But in terms of its relevance and its importance to the queer subculture of London, it's been going on for at least a century. And one of those places of which was one of the popular go-to destinations for the queer community at that time was, oh, there's Thesiger there. It was Kettner's restaurant. Kettner's restaurant, which is just by the Coach and Horses pub, just off the circus where Harry Potter and the Cursed Child is at the Cambridge Theatre. It's now currently shut up, but Kettner's is an iconic Soho institution founded by German-born chef August Kettner, although the person we're going to be talking about is actually his wife, Barbe Sangiorgi. If there's any Italian listeners here, I apologise profusely for my pronunciation of that. It's probably horrifically wrong. But Barbe Sangiorgi was, she was born in Belgium in 1833, and she married Kettner in Paris, where he was a chef and she was a chambermaid. And they were married in 1861. Now, in 1880, at the age of 46, she was married to 31-year-old Giovanni Sangiorgi, who was working at the restaurant at the time. And this marriage basically elevated him from waiter to business owner. Now, what's this got to do with queer history? Well, Kettner's was the go-to destination of one of the best-known members, I'd say, of the queer community historically. And the fact that Kettner's was a bit of a go-to destination for not only just the queer community, but for those of affluence. The Prince of Wales, luckily Edward VII, would frequently dine here because he could take his mistresses here for discretion. You know, he could literally show them in and no one would really bat an eyelid. And the queer community seized on this because, again, you had men who might have been opportuning for kind of instances of sex and what have you, or maybe they were quietly down low dating their boyfriends, or someone wanted a nice meal out. They could go to Kettner's and no one would care. And it was in this place, for example, that probably the best known of Barbe Sangiorgi's patrons dined, and I'm sure many of you know who I'm going to be referring to. This is an inside view of the restaurant in the 1920s. But one of the people who used to dine here was Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde loved dining here. It was one of his go-to destinations alongside the Café Royal. Now, they would have had all kinds of cuisine, like whitebait and, and all kinds of like pâtés and truffles and, God knows what have you. But it's also, Kettner's has a special kind of precedence in terms of queer history, in that when Oscar was on trial, I'll get to that as I talk about a person further down the line, Kettner's is mentioned because Kettner's, again, was one of these safe spaces that Oscar could take his dalliances. Alfred Lord Bosie, he used to dine with him very regularly there. And it was very much a place where people could, you know, sup on feasts of carp fillet à delou, fried gudgeon with asparagus and cream, devil kidney and thick eel stews, all followed by apple and almond tarts for dessert. Sounds like a complete recipe for a Gaviscon, if you ask me. But it was one of those marvelous destinations that people used to dine to. Now here we have, this is on the first time we did the tour. This is her grave. August is not buried with her. He's buried along the far wall closer to the main entrance. And Giovanni is actually buried in Switzerland. After she died in 1893, he went to Switzerland, and I think he practiced being a restaurateur over there. But one of the beautiful things about Barbe's grave is that it's very European, and there's no other monument in Brompton Cemetery like it. It's very kind of European classical. If you go to the continent, you'll see lots of graves like this. It wasn't really a very British thing. And as you can see, someone here is laying a rose at her grave, which just goes to show that her story, she was basically providing a safe space for queer people to meet. And, you know, from what we can tell, she didn't really care. She was more than happy to have her restaurant that she managed with her husband Giovanni to be one of those spaces with which, you know, could be one of those safe spaces particularly. So from Barbe, we move on to another person. Now, when we look at queer history in Brompton Cemetery, not everyone's going to be an ally, but they are part of queer history nonetheless. And the person I'm going to be talking about is just buried just down the road, virtually opposite Emmeline Pankhurst, who Sasha will be talking about presently. This is Richard Henn Collins. Now, he was an Irishman, much like Oscar Wilde, and he was considered a celebrity in the day. In the Strand magazine in 1896, he is noted as a celebrity, and one of the things that the Strand magazine, which used to publish the Sherlock Holmes novels, was that it would show celebrities at various stages in their life and then show their pastimes. He liked salmon fishing in Norway, if you want to know. He was born in 1842. He was alumni of Downing College, Cambridge, and was called to the English bar in 1867 and served on the Queen's Council for 8 years before becoming a judge in 1891. Now, his kind of notoriety was that he was the judge in Oscar Wilde's first case. Now, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Oscar Wilde, but if you're not, I'll give you a quick rundown. Oscar Wilde was in a relationship with Alfred Douglas, his affectionate Lord Bosie, and his father, John Sholto Douglas, who was not the nicest of men looking down the historical lens, but he did not approve of their relationship. And although they dined together, and initially, actually, they had a very good kind of repartee. You know, Alfred wanted Oscar to get on with his father, and they did. You know, again, they probably dined at Kettner's. They certainly dined at the Café Royal. But after a while, Bosie's father was suspicious of Oscar, and he was suspicious of his motives, to the point where he actually delivered a card to Oscar Wilde at the Albemarle Club, which was a gentleman's club with which Oscar Wilde was actually a member of. That's me at the grave. So this is the Celtic cross there, which is actually Collins's grave. Now, at the Albemarle Club, he actually delivered a card, which was on his business card, which said, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as sodomite." Now, it took 3 weeks for Oscar to eventually receive this card, but Oscar was absolutely apoplectic that he received this, because it basically openly called him a homosexual man. Now, looking down the historical lens, I think most of us are aware of Oscar's true leanings, but again, he was living at a time when it was not possible to be yourself. You couldn't do it. He wanted to present himself as a heterosexual man, but he was obviously having dalliances and so on. And so, enraged, he wanted to take the Marquis of Queensberry to court. He wanted to teach him a lesson, and his friends implored and pleaded and said, "Oscar, this is not a good idea. Do not open this hornet's nest. Please don't." But he did. And so the trial at the Old Bailey, which was presided by Baron Collins, as he would later be known. I'll show you a quick picture of Bosie's father there. It basically turned into, initially it was a great vehicle for Oscar's wit, but very quickly, the Marquis here pulled a couple of aces out from up his sleeve. He hired private investigators, which had been trailing Oscar unbeknownst to him, and it showed that he had been fraternising with cross-dressers, and with rent boys and all this kind of stuff, and it all came out in the press. And you know, there was also a really very bizarre altercation in the street, which was published in the papers of the time, where Alfred's brother Percy actually confronted his father and went, "Look, just leave them alone. They're not doing anyone any harm." To which the Marquis went, "No," and punched him in the face in broad daylight. He was a very aggressive man. And again, you know, it just kind of goes to show you the kind of the temperatures of temperaments, which were kind of going around and surrounding the case at the time. But again, Richard Henn Collins's overall involvement in the case was fairly muted. I mean, he did side with the Marquis eventually, but again, you know, in terms of the prominence of the case, this was probably the first presentation, bar Fanny and Stella back in the 1870s, where homosexuality was being presented as an identity. And the gay subculture of London had literally, up until that point, existed in almost the myths and whispers of society. It was now laid bare. And, you know, Henn Collins was essentially at the forefront of the judicial response to this. And, you know, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the repercussions of the Oscar Wilde cases, and indeed the effect that had on LGBTQ relations at the tail end of the 19th century. So from that, we then move on to a remarkable grave, probably one of the best known people buried in Brompton Cemetery.
Although we're not actually going to be talking about her. That's the strange thing. So we'll move on to her grave. So if we can go into the next slide. So we are going to be looking at the grave of Emmeline Pankhurst, you know, famous instigator of the suffragette movement, probably the icon for the suffragette movement. Now, obviously, nobody is really a hero. Everyone is complex, right? They have complex personalities. Some of the things that Emmeline did were amazing. Some of the things that she did were not so amazing. That's kind of what people are. But she is infamous and famous as the symbol of the women's right movement. But I'm not actually going to be talking directly about her. We are going to be talking about her daughter in a moment. But firstly, I want to talk about Julian Phelps Allen. So let's look at the headstone, because the headstone was carved by Julian Phelps Allen. So Julian Phelps Allen was a sculptor. Now I'm going to pause here and say, with Julian, using the correct pronoun, so by pronoun I mean he or her or they, is a complex situation, because Julian changed their name. So I will be opting for the gender neutral they, which might be incorrect, just so you know. So Julian changed their name, which was not the name at birth, but I will not be using Julian's dead name, to Julian, because they wanted a masculine man's name. At this time, Julian was a man's name, first and foremost. Julian did not live a life that was necessarily, you know, gender normative for a woman, but that doesn't mean that they weren't a woman necessarily, just because they were doing things that women of the time didn't do. But for example, they became a captain in World War I, serving in France. Again, quite an incredible role to rise to someone who had been assigned female at birth. Now here's a complex situation. Julian used to like to use she, her pronouns, but they hated to be called a woman. They did not like to be called a woman. So this is where you get to this complex thing. Do I use she, her because they was not in use, and maybe Julian would have chosen they, or maybe they would have chosen she. So just know that I'm doing this as carefully as I can. But Julian was an incredible person. They became this sculptor, creating wonderful pieces. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see some of Julian's works, which kind of mix together a sort of Art Deco style. It's very highly modern, remembering that Julian started work back, you know, in the very early 1900s. And Julian was creating artworks particularly for the feminist movement, for the socialist movement. It's definitely clear that Julian, irrespective of how they defined, aligned with the suffragette movement, that they aligned with progressive movements. They definitely saw themselves as different from the rest of society. Now, in terms of the name change and how we identify what that might mean, whether Julian would identify as being a trans man, a non-binary person or a lesbian woman. It's difficult to know exactly, but the Tate Modern, who've explored Julian's work and looked into the letters that Julian wrote, can see that this is someone who is playing with gender. This is someone who is basically giving the finger to the status quo and saying, look, I want to be like this. I'm going to have this name. I'm going to use this pronoun sometimes. I don't want to be called a woman. I want to be respected for my art. You don't need to know if I'm a man or a woman to admire my art. That was something that was very important to Julian, that their artwork spoke first and foremost. Now, moving on to the next slide, we're going to go back to that memorial. So that memorial, which is for Emmeline Pankhurst. Well, Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter was Christabel Pankhurst, one of her daughters. And Christabel was someone that we have some interesting queer connections to, particularly through the diary and letter writings of Mary Blaythwaite, and she's the woman that's depicted on the far right. Now, talking about bisexual or lesbian suffragettes is complicated, because if you look at the picture at the top right, suffragettes were depicted in a very cruel, hateful way by the newspaper and the press. And one of the ways was to call them lesbians, although they probably wouldn't use that term. They would refer to sapphic leanings, or ladies that prefer the company of ladies. And the joke was that they were ugly, right? They were hideous women who couldn't get a man, and that's why they became suffragettes. You would only join the women's lib movement if you were too ugly to get married, right? That was their character type. And therefore, a lot of people would infer that they would go for other women because it's the only person they could get. So a lot of the insinuations about suffragettes being queer or lesbian is kind of wrapped up in that negative stereotype. But what's great with Mary Blaythwaite, and I've got these diary articles and letter writing, which is from the Gloucester Archives, show her writing about her relationships with other women, and she wrote beautifully and brazenly. There's no apology there about the women that she shared beds with. You know, I love this person. I've always found the appearance of a man to be quite horrid and disgusting, but a woman I find to be beautiful and fertile. And sharing a bed and having intimate moments of cuddling and caressing. So these very kind of close moments, again, I'm not going to use the word lesbian or bisexual, but these were women that shared beds, that shared lives, and were incredibly romantically connected with each other. So here are a couple of quotes. Annie slept with someone else again last night. This is the writings of Mary talking about someone else. There was someone else in Annie's bed this morning. So they're kind of monitoring who's sleeping with who and who's having relationships with who, because queer women, whilst not the only people in the suffragette movement, were incredibly important as part of that movement. And one of the objects of Mary's affection was Christabel, who was known within the suffragettes for being particularly beautiful. Now, the letter that I've depicted there is actually really beautiful. It's from the Blaythwaite estate, so it's of Mary Blaythwaite's hand. And it is a cutting of a tree that Christabel and her mother had planted in the Mary Blaythwaite estate. And they've taken a clipping of this. And this is Mary writing to another woman that she had a crush on, and she would use the term crush. And she sent a cutting of that tree, of Christabel's tree. And this is basically the letter that accompanied that. Here's a bit of the tree that Christabel planted for me, which this tree was sacred and holy because it had been planted by a woman that she had such affection for. So it's just goes to show that sometimes these stories aren't just the people that are buried there, it's the people that made the monuments that have these queer connections, and it's the people connected to the people that are buried there that have these queer connections. And this is our very last stop of the tour. So thank you so much for joining us. I know we overran a bit, but we don't get much of a chance to do tours anymore, and we love talking about the stuff that we're passionate about. So here's the two of us. We were doing a socially distanced video that we've been producing for the Brunel Museum about the queer stories connected to the tunnel underground. So that will be released over the rest of February. And if you want to find us, Sheldon is at Cemetery Club, but also Sheldon K. Goodman on Twitter. I am at Sasha Coward on Twitter, and of course at the Royal Parks, and we are so grateful to them for letting us do our thing and talk about stuff. One last slide, and I promise you this is the only slide of narcissism that we will include, which is just to say that we are doing a lot of stuff, and you can come and see more of the things that we're doing as well. So February 25th is another cemetery tour with Sheldon. We're doing a steampunk, which is a queer history cabaret with Ironbridge Gorge Museum on February 27th. That's a Saturday, which is going to be great fun. Sheldon is also doing tours throughout March and April as well, some of which are going to be virtual. So yeah, please do join us, and thank you very much. Hopefully we've got some time for a few questions, Charlie.
Indeed we do. Thank you so much. What a really jam-packed tour, well, socially distanced tour, COVID secure tour of Brompton Cemetery, and we've got some lovely comments in the question and answer. So I'm going to pop you back on screen if you don't mind. Who would like to go first for the first question?
I will.
Here we go then. Let's send you live so everyone can see you. So The first question we've got is, have you pieced together the research from the parliamentary archives or other sources, or is queerness evident on tombstones?
It's definitely not evident on tombstones, and I think I'm going to chuck to Sheldon after I give my answer, because he is the expert on cemetery history. But you know, tombstones, they tend to be pretty standard. So the quotes, the writing, particularly if you're talking about the Victorian Edwardian period, there's a certain set of things you see written, and very rarely do you see something that would talk about queerness, because that would be seen as vulgar. You wouldn't put that on the tombstone. So generally it is looking through records, written documents, the likes of Mary Blaithwaite, people that wrote letters and diaries to the queer people in this audience, LGBTQ+. If you keep a diary, we love you. Future historians will love you. You may think it's silly, but please keep it, because it lets us know more about you. And when we get those moments, that's fantastic. What would you say, Sheldon?
I would say, yeah, I mean, headstones in many respects, they're very good at demonstrating one thing, mainly wealth. But in terms of useful things like favourite colour, who did you fancy, they're pretty rubbish. They're not. There are kind of exceptions to this rule for sure. You know, if you go to Kensal Green Cemetery, for example, if you go to, I think it's the grave of William Mulready, the artist. Round the back of him is a grave that is shunted right up close next to him. I mean, you know, these are Victorian cemeteries; they're all going to be full. But in terms of kind of like, you know, in neatness and order, the guy who's shunted up next to him was actually very close to him in life, and it's very much. It's been supposed that there was this kind of emulates the relationship that they had in life. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But in terms of headstones, you know, again, headstones didn't come cheaply. A lot of them simply, you know, just say, you know, name, date of birth, date of death, biblical passage, done. That's it. Yeah. So it kind of, in terms of extrapolating queer history from that is difficult. It's you know, it is like looking for a needle in a haystack. So in many respects, the headstone is not the place you go for any kind of a first port of call. So you know, that's where you kind of like turn to like census records or diaries, again, as Sasha said, or you know, or any kind of other kind of revealing document that might give a clearer idea of the person buried 6 feet under.
I've just thought of one quick example I will throw out there. If you go to Highgate Cemetery, we came across a grave to a man called Tom Wakefield, and on his headstone it says writer, educator, mother, and we were like, Tom Wakefield's a mother? And then we looked into it. He was a gay man who was known for looking after basically young runaway gay men. He was basically seen as a mother in the community. So that's a case of a headstone telling you a lot, but you're right, Sheldon, generally they don't. What other questions do we have, Charlie?
So we have one that says, what would you recommend to do if you're interested in researching queer history in your local cemeteries? Thanks so much, by the way. This has been great.
Oh.
Go on, Sheldon, you take this one.
I'd say patience. I mean, even just researching, like, you know, even if you're researching, like, say, you know, straight history, for example, it requires a formidable amount of patience and time to try and extrapolate those stories. I mean, again, this is a prime example. This is a 170-odd-year-old cemetery. We've got 8 stories that we know of, and it's not as if, you know, we've done this and moved on to other projects. We've quietly been looking in the background, you know, for kind of people that we can add to this essential database of queer history. It's okay. I mean, to a certain extent, a lot of it is down to luck. A lot of this, you know, a lot of the relationships that the people of the past had, they didn't write it down for obvious reasons. They didn't want to incriminate themselves. They didn't want to kind of, you know, be seen to be doing something that was seen as socially unacceptable. But it's one of those, but it's all the more rewarding for when you do eventually find those stories. So, you know, again, you know, we kind of did a queer tour around Arna's Vale Cemetery in Bristol as well, and we found instances of queerness there as well. So take your time, patience, and eventually you'll come across something. But yeah, don't expect to find it ready and waiting for you at the top of the pile, for sure.
Brilliant. That kind of covered the next one, but I'd like to just touch on the end of this person's question. So, what is a favourite moment for you that you've had when researching this tour?
Well, go on, Sasha, you go first.
Okay, so I think I've made it pretty clear that I'm pretty in love with LUISA CASATI. I think one of the powerful moments is, it's a difficult one to describe. If you're a queer historian, you often have this like spidey sense, right? You get a tingle around someone and you're like, I'm not going to make any assumptions. We do try whenever possible not to make any assumptions about anyone. I was like, I just get the sense that LUISA, she was doing all of these things and she was all over, she was in Capri. And then I stumbled across this book, The Extraordinary Women, which is basically a book about lesbians. And in it is this wonderful, like, whole paragraph about LUISA CASATI, the relationship with Romaine Brooks. I found the painting of Romaine Brooks. And there's this like massive energy rush you get when you go, yes, I knew it. I knew there was a connection. I knew I felt like a sense of connection with LUISA. And then you see it on paper, you see it in the real records in the archives, and you're able to bring it to life. What about you, Sheldon? What's your fave?
I'd say it's knowing that you're rediscovering lives in a time that is far more sympathetic to their leanings that they experienced in their own. It's a pleasure to know the stories of, say, Ernest Thesiger, or, you know, or the, you know, again, they weren't gay, but the KEELEYS and so on, because we are more receptive and we're more welcoming to their lifestyles. And knowing that these people had to embrace and basically, you know, put up appearances, quite literally, you know, relations of the time, just knowing that, you know, someone 170 odd, 150, however long it is after their death, there's someone who is, and hopefully, you know, the people watching tonight, you will feel this as well. You're being reacquainted with their lives, and it's kind of like, they were pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And this is a recognition that many of them never had in their own lifetimes. So, you know, wherever, you know, if you happen to live locally to Brompton, or if you live, I don't know, in Stranraer or Dublin or wherever you come from, if you go to a cemetery and you find stories, particularly queer stories, you know, just think that you are part of a wider narrative and a wider connection and chain. So, you know, we are all a community. Whether we're living or dead is irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. It's just knowing that we can champion those voices from the past, I think, and that's what makes it all the more worthwhile when you find these stories once more. Brilliant.
Sheldon, I've got one that says, is there any chance we can have a closer look at Sheldon's glorious choker? It looks superb.
Right, well, okay. Right, so this is from my friend Nick Coveney. It's a skeleton mermaid.
Wow.
Which is, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know. I can't see myself, so I don't know if I can
see you. That's beautiful.
Yes.
There we go.
Special occasions.
And one last one. So, what was the Dead London podcast again, please? I can't find it. Thanks for a great hour. I'll be back for more tours, both here and in person, as soon as possible. Dead London podcast?
Oh no, the London Dead. The London Dead. It's a blog, so a bit like Cemetery Club. Again, there's so many of us, but yeah, the London Dead. It's called, by David Bigham.
Brilliant, thank you. So that wraps up our Queerly Departed online talk, and I just want to extend a very special thank you to Sasha and Sheldon for again, a superb whiz through Brompton history. There's so much to discover on site, and there's so much yet to discover and interpret, and it's just been a fantastic hour, so thank you so much. Just a reminder to everybody that this will be put on our YouTube channel, and so if you missed it or had to drop out, or you want to hear something in a bit more detail, it will be online in the next few weeks. And that's it for tonight. If you do want to contribute and send a donation in, the links are there for both the Royal Parks and AKT charity. And I just want to say thank you and good night. And I really hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Stay safe.